Hello everybody, hope you're doing well and thanks for joining us for another video. Now, the discussions about whether or not people have been to the moon usually cover a vast range of topics. And one in particular that I've seen brought up a few times that I thought would make an interesting video is that of re-entry. The final few minutes of a mission when the crew are returning through the Earth's atmosphere. And the claim that I've seen made about this as apparent proof that humans can't have been to the moon is comments along the lines of this one from SamC1513, stating that the Apollo command modules were traveling 25,000 miles an hour when they hit the atmosphere at an altitude of 75 miles, and claiming that dropping 25,000 miles an hour over a distance of only 75 miles would have caused such violent deceleration that the crew inside would not have survived. In fact, Sam is very passionate about this point, bringing it up many times, even on videos that have nothing to do with the moon landings or even space. Now, I do somewhat agree with Sam's point. Decelerating by 25,000 miles an hour over a distance of only 75 miles would not be survivable. However, that's not what Apollo craft experienced. The short debunk of this claim is, although Sam's figures are somewhat correct in that the Apollo craft were returning at a speed of around 25,000 miles an hour, and entry interface, the point where they hit the atmosphere, was at an altitude of 400,000 feet or about 75 miles, Sam's idea of decelerating by that much from an altitude of 75 miles requires that the command module be traveling straight down, perpendicular to Earth, when in fact the command modules re-enter the atmosphere at a very shallow angle, so to descend by 75 miles actually meant they travelled more than 1,000 miles across Earth's surface. Like how when a plane descends by 35,000 feet, it travels much further than 35,000 feet in the process. Although I've then had other comments like this one that go into more detail about re-entry occurring at an angle, but still claiming that the G-loads would have been fatal. So I thought that this would make an interesting video learning the physics of re-entry. And if you enjoy it, then you could re-enter learning physics with today's sponsor, Brilliant.org. For me, Brilliant is one of the easiest and most effective ways to learn. Just a few minutes each day, even while you're out on the go, can help improve your critical thinking skills. Made all the more effective with its interactive animations that make topics much easier to understand. And there's no shortage of topics to choose from. Not just physics, but many branches of maths, computer science and data analysis as well. All starting from the basics and building up gradually, so there is something for everyone. For example, I've just started their 100 Days of Puzzles section. In fact, I love using Brilliant so much that at the time of recording, I am past 790 consecutive days using it. Try it for free yourself for 30 days by visiting brilliant.org/Dave McKeegan, and doing so will also get you 20% off their annual subscription. So, firstly, let's establish a few basics. A spacecraft returning to Earth will pass through the atmosphere, but the atmosphere is not a constant density at all altitudes. It's densest nearest sea level, and it gets gradually less dense the higher up you go, hence why people can't breathe unaided at very high altitude. So denser air creates more resistance than thinner air, but traveling faster also creates more resistance because you are then encountering more air molecules each second than you would if you were traveling slower. So even at very high altitudes, even up on the fringes of space, a spacecraft will experience some atmospheric drag. And obviously the molecules that the craft moves out of the way have to go somewhere. Now, a flat-sided object will push those air molecules straight back against the flow of air coming at it, which creates more resistance, versus a sleek shape, which glances the molecules out of the way. Now, a craft in space traveling around the Earth where it stays the same altitude will be in a circular orbit. Though in reality, very rarely do spacecraft actually have a perfectly circular orbit. Usually, they are slightly elliptical, where the distance to Earth will fluctuate slightly. The point in the orbit where the spacecraft is closest to Earth is called the perigee, and its furthest distance is its apogee. Now, if a spacecraft at perigee increases its speed, that will push the apogee further away from Earth. Conversely, if it slows down, then it will reduce its apogee. And likewise, when at apogee, it can speed up or slow down to increase or decrease its perigee. And finally, a craft on such an elliptical orbit does not maintain a constant velocity. As it's traveling away from Earth, gravity will be slowing it down. It will reach its apogee when the velocity moving away from Earth reaches zero, at which point the distance to Earth begins reducing because gravity is pulling the craft back to Earth. This causes the speed to then increase more and more until it reaches perigee, when it will be at its fastest velocity, and there the cycle will start again of slowing down as it begins moving further away from Earth. Now, with no external forces involved, a craft in an elliptical orbit around Earth will keep going in that same cycle indefinitely. All craft returning to Earth are traveling at speeds upwards of 17,000 miles an hour, and they need to reach zero on the ground. And obviously, parachutes alone is not going to achieve that. So instead, most of the speed is lost through the resistance of re-entering the atmosphere. But here is where we come to the balance which must be achieved. Because a craft in low Earth orbit is orbiting once every 90 minutes, and to return to Earth, they drop their perigee into the atmosphere and then let resistance slow them down. And this in turn will reduce their apogee into the atmosphere as well, so that the craft's path then will not leave the atmosphere. But if they don't lose enough speed coming through the atmosphere, their apogee could remain in space, so they would then skim through the upper atmosphere, slowing down a bit, but not enough to bring them straight back to Earth. And they would then wind up continuing back up into space. But if that happened, 90 minutes later, they would have completed another orbit and would be dipping back into the atmosphere again. So within an hour or so, they would have returned back to Earth. Things, though, get a bit trickier when returning from the moon, because they spend 3 days being pulled back to Earth by gravity, so their approach speed is faster, at some 25,000 miles an hour, and their apogee is still sitting out at lunar distance. So if their perigee is too high and they skim through the atmosphere and back into space, their apogee might have decreased slightly, but it could be days before the craft completes another orbit, by which point the crew would have long run out of air. Now you might think, okay, just drop the perigee low enough that it hits the Earth, so there's no chance of them skipping back out into space. The problem there, though, is they hit the upper atmosphere at very high speeds, but the atmosphere is very thin, so it does decelerate the craft partially, but not particularly fast. If they come in at a very steep angle, it would mean they would still be traveling at incredibly high speeds when they then hit the much denser atmosphere low down. This would cause huge forces and heat buildup far beyond what the craft is capable of withstanding, and it would break apart. So Apollo craft had something referred to as a re-entry corridor, which was a path that they could enter the atmosphere on that was steep enough to ensure they lost sufficient speed as to not go sailing back off into space, yet shallow enough that they had as much time as possible to lose the speed gradually and avoid overstressing and overheating. And this is where we come to the clever trick employed with spacecraft re-entry. You'll notice that the heat shield at the base of the Apollo command module has a slight curvature to it, so it's not completely flat-sided, but it does create a very large amount of resistance, as opposed to re-entering the other way around, for example, which would be more streamlined, but not advised because they would then burn up. So with this slightly curved shape, the air molecules would be deflected back in the same general direction that they came in from, but at a slight angle. This actually causes a shockwave to form in front of the command module, so when you see these huge streaks of flame surrounding it, that is actually air being compressed rapidly and driven around the sides by this leading shockwave. Now, if the craft hit the atmosphere straight on, then the air would be deflected away equally in all directions, which would cause equal opposing forces in all directions. Like how if you're traveling at high speed in a car and you put your hand out of the window with your palms square to the airflow. But if you angle your hand slightly, you can drive the air either up or down, and you will feel your hand being pushed in the opposite direction. And the Apollo command module could do something similar. By traveling at a slight angle in relation to the airflow, they could force more air to be pushed away in one particular direction, which in turn would push the craft more in the other direction. I.e., angling the heat shield slightly upwards would force more air upwards and thus push the command module down. If they angled it slightly down, then it would create more lift. And the Apollo craft would use this to not only help control their path to a target landing area, but to increase how much time they spent at higher altitudes to allow them to scrub off a bit more speed before they reach thicker atmosphere. If you look at a graph that plots the Apollo reentry, you can see they descended pretty quickly from 400 to 200,000 feet, where there's very little air to generate any lift. But by 200,000 feet, given the speed that they were traveling, there then became sufficient lift to be able to hold themselves at that sort of altitude for a minute or two whilst they scrubbed off some more speed before they then began descending back down again. These small periods of climb would also allow time for some of the heat that had built up to dissipate away. And I think it's quite interesting how they achieved this control. Because to just straight up change the tilt of the command module, facing such a huge amount of resistance from the airflow hitting against it, would have required very powerful thrusters if fired up or down. Instead, the command module used thrusters that fired sideways to rotate the command module, and the command module itself was designed with its center of mass not being on the center line of the craft. This meant that the command module naturally sat at a slight angle. Then, rotating the craft would cause it to rotate around its center of mass, which in turn would change the angle of the heat shield and thus be able to change the amount of lift being generated. You can actually somewhat see this offset center of mass of the command module as well. When it's coming down on parachute, it's not hanging straight down, it's hanging on a slight tilt. So the re-entry of Apollo was not a straight 90-degree fall from space, nor was it even a constant 6-degree fall in either. It was an angled drop partway into the atmosphere, then a rise back up to lose more speed and reduce heat before ever reaching thicker levels of atmosphere. And so it would not then generate the huge G-forces either that would have then harmed the crew. And you can actually see the rolls and the change in lift in some of the footage that was shot during Apollo re-entries. You can see the command module rolling in order to adjust its angle to then control its trajectory. And other craft did similar things. Orion, for example, can be seen in its re-entry footage also rotating to control its flight path. Although Orion takes things a step further than Apollo did with something called a skip re-entry. As covered earlier, slowing down at perigee will decrease your apogee, and with enough speed you can skim through the atmosphere and pass back up into space. So there is actually a very narrow window where a craft can skim through the atmosphere and climb back up into space, but have scrubbed off just enough speed that their apogee is then only a few miles further into space, so they will then quickly re-enter the atmosphere again. This will give the heat shield more time to dissipate that built-up heat from the first part of re-entry. Likely more important with Orion because it weighs almost twice as much as the Apollo command modules, so would be carrying a lot more energy that needs to be lost during re-entry. Even the space shuttle employed a similar process with their re-entries with a procedure called role reversal. The underside of the shuttle orbiter was protected by the heat shield, so they had to re-enter the atmosphere belly first. Now, to get the most drag requires a very high angle of attack, but that straight up nose would then produce a lot of lift that they didn't always want. So they would increase their bank angle by rotating the orbiter to its side, which would then reduce the vertical lift by shifting some of the resulting force sideways. But then to stop them veering too far off their flight path, they would do a role reversal to flip the direction of the horizontal force. So the shuttle didn't climb back up quite the same way as Apollo or Orion, but it did use its aerodynamic lift to prolong its descent and allow more time to slow down gradually. So, there you have it. Spacecraft re-entry isn't just a case of fall through the atmosphere and hope for the best. There is actually quite a bit of control involved to carefully scrub away the speed without overstressing the craft or the crew. And that is going to draw this video to a close. As always, feel free to leave your thoughts in the comments down below. If you enjoyed this video and you haven't already done so, then please do consider hitting the like and subscribe buttons, and hopefully we'll see you in the next video.